Unprecedented events are happening in the Atlantic Ocean right now. A Category 5 hurricane in the month of July, early July. Category 4 hurricane in June. So I will do a more in-depth breakdown of this later on as to just how anomalous this is. But with all this news of tropical cyclones, I actually want to go through what my personal experience with tropical cyclones was going back in time. 2023 was an active hurricane season, but despite that, there was very little land impact to the United States, especially in the northeastern United States. There were still some storms, like Tropical Storm Ophelia in the month of September, which did bring a couple inches of rain to New York, and it did cause some disruptions to the area. But it really just was a wet weekend, a wet extended weekend, thanks to Yom Kippur. And obviously then New York City would get some of the worst flash flooding it's seen in its life just a few days later. And even though that was sort of connected to Ophelia, it wasn't really the same storm. So again, that was relatively mild. And besides that, there really was nothing. Hurricane Franklin did close some beaches to swimming at the end of August and beginning of September. But that was really it. And to be honest, when the beaches were closed, kind of coincided with some of the coolest weather during that stretch. I mean, I'm not going to say August is hot, but there was certainly some warmer days. But then the beaches shut down, and then everything kind of went cold. When the beaches finally reopened, that was when a massive heat wave was beginning. But by that point, you could go to the beach at that point. You had your kind of warm period from August 26th to 29th, or 30th. And the 30th when the beach was closed. August 31st to September 2nd was pretty cool. And then by the 2nd, the beaches reopened in time for September 3rd to 9th, which was a really hot period. And again, there was a lot of rain in August, but most of that did not came from severe thunderstorms crossing in the pre-dawn hours, and not actually from not actually from a tropical storm. So that really is it for 2023. 2022, Hurricane Nicole did cause some impacts, but again, that was just your average rainy day that we experience all the time. Hurricane Ian was worse in the sense that it was actually 5 days of inclement weather, and the inclement weather really began earlier, so it actually felt more like 6 days straight of horribly inclement weather. So that was that. That was that. Now, Hurricane Ian, again, it was actually a horrible storm for Florida, and it caused some real impacts in New Jersey, but again, here, it was just a long sustained period of crappy weather. Again, nothing, really like that severe from that, and before there wasn't really anything that bad that, crossed our area either. Now, 2021, on the other hand, was a very aggressive year for tropical cyclones in the New York metropolitan area, and based on the way I'm going, I do have to start with the worst of them, Hurricane Ida. So, Hurricane Ida was an interesting storm, because even though it made landfall in Louisiana, the remnants brought moisture up to New York, in the Northeast. Now, one would usually think in this case that even though there was some, some impacts to be expected, it was going to be like a minor footnote. Think of how Ian was, and Ian was a relatively aggressive example. There are a lot more passive examples that you could think of where it was just like a day of bad weather, where it's hard to mistake it for the average just day of drizzly weather. Ida was not like that, because Ida dumped 2 inches of rain on Long Island and like 7 on the city. It broke records. And unlike the September flooding, which didn't lead to any casualties, this caused over $20 billion in damage in the Northeast and led to 50 casualties. Tornadoes in the Northeast that turned fatal. You don't hear about that very often. And this is one of those storms that was similar to Camille in a sense, of how it caused really bad flooding far away from the center, and was also a great example of how climate change could be influencing these events. Now, fortunately, we didn't lose power, even though 7% of my hamlet did. And we didn't lose power, and ultimately the impacts weren't that bad. Ultimately the impacts were not that bad. But in the city, it was traumatic, and this was one of the worst storms that New York City ever had to experience in its history. I think it was the worst storm since Sandy. Again, in my area, the flooding wasn't bad enough to the point where it was dangerous. But again, they got extremely, and I mean extremely fortunate that was not the case and that it wasn't a bad storm. Again, if I could edit anything into this, I would have, but my iMovie kind of sucks, and I also didn't really take film of these storms. Now, Hurricane Henri, I actually don't have a personal experience of it. Yes, I know that it affected my area, but while Hurricane Henri was affecting Long Island, I was on vacation in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh and extending out to West Virginia and Ohio is where I went. And even though, Henri's impacts did extend out to Pennsylvania, they didn't extend far enough west into Pennsylvania to really cause an impact into Pittsburgh. Now, it did cause a heat dome to be exacerbated there, but you really can't blame it on that. That's sort of like saying I was affected by Hurricane Hillary because it caused the heat dome in Iowa where I was vacationing, leading to 120 degrees heat indexes. Yes, that absolutely sucked, but I'm not sure I could blame Hillary's impacts for that. It's not as direct as San Francisco, where, yes, you could say the plume of warm air was brought up and that's why it got so hot there. You can't really say that when you're thousands of miles away from where the storm actually was. Again, Hillary's impacts stretched all the way up to Montana where they were bad. But Iowa, you really can't say for a storm like that. And that's why I can't mention Henri here. Hurricane Elsa, on the other hand, that was a different story. Hurricane Elsa, that brought intense flash flooding in New York. That was actually a storm I would remember because we were coming back from the Kalahari in Pennsylvania, and the storms got really bad while we were trying to cross the George Washington Bridge. And we wound up getting stuck in a Trans-Manhattan tunnel on I-95 for almost an hour. That stretch of road, which goes from the George Washington Bridge all the way out to the Alexander Hamilton Bridge, is less than a mile. We were stuck on it for almost an hour. So that was, again, like a really, really bad storm. That was just like a bad storm. That, especially for people in transit, because an hour and a half of rain dropped in a single hour. Now, after that, the travel was fine after that, but the subway was shut down too, and cars were being rescued from the roads. Again, that's bad. Elsa was just a bit of a warm-up to Ida, which would terrorize the city a little bit later. If you think about it, with how bad our campus struggled during Elsa, if it instead had to come through during Ida, when roads were actually being closed, and it was fatal level flooding, I think that campus story could have turned into a tragedy. I really think that. Of course, this is actually the prefrontal system to Elsa, that we're not sure if it was actually connected to it. Actual Elsa, again, was just a day of more inclement weather, and most of the rain came down early in the morning anyway, so it wasn't, exactly the same. But the pre-Elsa thing was definitely something I'm going to remember for a while. And now this is 2020, COVID year. Again, you have the annoying remnants of certain storms. Zeta, I'm not going to say it was memorable here, just because, again, it was just your average rain, although it was much colder than I expected it to, because while it was raining, the temperatures were actually in the 40s, which I was caught off guard by. But it did snow literally in Connecticut, so I'm sure that was memorable, that a hurricane was actually dropping snow. I mean, they happened, but still. Then you have the remnants of Delta and Laura causing just general annoyances. Isaias was really the storm of the year, because that I actually lost a power for 6 days, because the tree damage here was extensive. A third of Long Island lost power, because even though we were generally used to storms bringing their rain side over and not their wind, Isaias was different, and sustained winds on Long Island did reach up to 40 miles an hour. Gusts were in the 70s. And that actually had a really bad impact on the power grid here. Meanwhile, compared to Tropical Storm Faye, which wasn't as bad, even though it did produce lots of flooding, that was also during COVID year. So normally camp would just go inside the building, and now they just find alternate activities to do, unless the weather's so bad to the point where you can't even be outside. So for an Isaias level storm, yes, camp will be canceled for the day, even if it happened in 2024. You just can't leave your house and that kind of stuff. But for a storm like Faye, they wouldn't cancel. But they had to, because it was COVID and they couldn't do anything. So again, that's why Faye was notable to me. 2019, we had to deal with the annoyances of Hurricane Barry, but I don't actually remember that storm that much, even though Barry was still a pretty intense storm when it reached New York. I don't know why I don't remember Hurricane Barry that much, but I don't. And again, there weren't really any other bad tropical cyclones across the area. Sure, subtropical storm Melissa was annoying, but it wasn't that bad, and it mostly affected New England. Now, 2018, again, remnants of storms were annoying, but I don't really remember anything, and same in 2017. And 2016 and 2015 too. I guess it's because as I'm going back, but really the only devastating hurricanes I remember in my early childhood was 2012 with Sandy, obviously, where the power was out for a week and almost everyone on the island lost power. That was just a horrible storm. And there were many deaths in Irene where the power went out for 5 days, so that might not have been because of Irene, that might have been because I was playing around with my AC like the immature 4-year-old that I was back then. Because yes, when Irene struck, I was 4 years old. Either way, there was lots of flooding with Irene. Sandy didn't really have that much rain, but it had lots of wind and storm surge, which caused a devastating impact on New York City.